Welcome, Left Reckoners, to another Sunday show. I'm Matt Leck. With me, Sandeep Vaheesan. He is legal director at the Open Markets Institute and author of Democracy in Power, A History of Electrification in the United States. Sandeep, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Matt.
Now, let's start with a very basic, pretty rudimentary question. What is a public utility?
Yeah, so public utility is an entity that we, through our elected representatives, have decided provides an essential service and should be regulated or directly provided by the state. So classic examples include power company, the gas company, the water service, sewer service. And what constitutes a public utility can change over time. So a century ago, ice companies were routinely regulated as public utilities because many people didn't have indoor refrigeration. They needed large quantities of ice to keep their food fresh. Obviously, ice is no longer quite as essential as it was. Today, I would argue that broadband companies should be regulated as public utilities. They aren't for assorted reasons. So that's the public utility at a high level. And so when a public utility is a private entity, what typically happens is state government will regulate its rates, require it to serve all customers, oversee its planning. For instance, is it investing in sufficient infrastructure to keep the lights on 5 years from now, 10 years from now? So it's in a sense, it can be a private entity that's heavily regulated by the government, or in some cases owned by the government itself. So in most places, water service is provided by a publicly owned entity as opposed to a private company that's regulated by the public.
Yeah, and I think it's just to emphasize the sort of state creation of that, and even, corporations for that matter, as if they sort of act like these things have a life of their own, but they are state creations ostensibly toward some end beyond just the profits of the people involved, correct?
Right. So if you looked at the earliest corporations in the United States, they were chartered for a very specific public purpose. For instance, to build a turnpike or build a canal or operate a bank. And it was understood that these were quasi-public institutions. They were given special powers and privileges to carry out some public service. Unfortunately, what happened over time is executives and at these corporations, lawyers representing these corporations, successfully persuaded judges, legislators, and ultimately most of the public that these are actually private institutions and that we should be very reluctant to regulate them, or better yet, not regulate them at all. But you're right, the corporation is a state creation. It's given special powers, such as separate personhood, limited liability. The problem today is those privileges are not paired with accompanying responsibilities and duties to the public. So it's a very one-sided bargain between the state and the corporation.
Right. And, your book covers a wide range in history. It doesn't start with FDR here, but let's zoom toward, I guess, the immediate preceding era. What was the context for electrification when FDR assumed office? And, I found it very interesting to hear about the naming of the Hoover Dam and, how that, I never really, I guess, paused on the incongruity of how that was named after a Hoover.
Yeah. So no, it's a very ironic name, and I'll explain that a little more in a second. But if you go back to the late 1920s, electric power had been on the scene for decades. Thomas Edison built his power plant in lower Manhattan in 1882. So electricity was a well-established technology. But the reality in the 1920s was most people who lived in cities had basic electric service. So if you're a working or middle-class person, you might have a few lights, a radio, but not much more beyond that. You wouldn't necessarily have a refrigerator or a vacuum cleaner or a washing machine. Those were seen as luxuries, owned principally by wealthy people. And the power company's view was that electricity, in a sense, is a luxury. Ordinary people should have limited service, and wealthy people should enjoy full electrification. So that was the situation in the cities. If you look at the countryside, where roughly 1 in 2 Americans lived during the 1920s, the vast majority of people didn't have any electric service at all. And the reason was rural areas tend to be sparsely populated. So if you built a mile of line in the countryside, you might serve 3 or 4 farms. By comparison, if you built a mile of line in the city, you might serve 300 to 400 customers. So rural electrification would entail a large upfront expenditure to serve relatively few people. So that was one reason. The second reason was the private power companies were generally skeptical that rural Americans would actually use all that much electricity. They subscribed to the view that people in the countryside were hopelessly backward. They were not ready to embrace modern technology. So even if they spent all this money building rural lines, they wouldn't actually sell much juice. So that was the state of things in the late 20s and the early 30s. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt runs for president of the United States in 1932, and he gives this fascinating speech in Portland, Oregon in September of that year, where he outlines his vision for the power sector. And one thing he says is electricity should no longer be treated as a luxury. It's a necessity. It can make people's standard of living significantly higher, both in cities and the countryside. He talks about how electrification can improve farm operations, increase output of crops, livestock, etc. And he says this is unacceptable. The status quo will not be tolerated if I'm elected. And so what he says is he wants to keep private ownership the norm in the power sector. He's not calling for full nationalization. But he's saying these companies need to be much better regulated. They were regulated at the time, but he identifies some ways in which public utility regulation is failing to live up to its promise. So he has this nice line in there where he says the public utility regulators think of themselves as arbitrators between the utility and the public, when in fact they should be thinking of themselves as agents or trustees of the public, really acting on behalf of the public. So that's one part of the speech. The second thing, more interesting and radical theme in the speech is he talks about this idea of public yardsticks. He said the federal government should actually go into the power business on a large scale. He calls for damming 4 major rivers, the Columbia in the Pacific Northwest, the Colorado in the Southwest, the Tennessee in the Southeast, and the St. Lawrence in the Northeast. And he says these should be federally built and operated dams that will generate large amounts of low-cost hydroelectricity. And he says the federal government, by doing this, can provide a yardstick against which to judge the performance of the private sector. The federal government will generate and sell electricity at cost and force the private utilities to keep up or lose market share. So this is one important theme of the speech. The second theme, which he uses a colorful metaphor, is he says all communities should have the right to take the birch rod out of the cupboard. He's appealing to corporal punishment to discipline private utilities. He says every community should have the right to take over their private utility and operate it as a public agency if the rates are too high and the quality of service is too low. And he says if the threat of the birch rod is credible, that should be enough to get good behavior, high quality service, low rates from private utilities. So he lays out this vision in Portland. He's obviously elected in a landslide in November of 1932, and he and Congress quickly go about implementing this vision.
The Birch Rod part was interesting because, obviously the metaphor is pretty horrific in terms of corporal punishment, but the attitude towards corporations and interests that are getting in the way of, say, delivering cheap electricity, it's an attitude that it seems kind of might be necessary to spur action.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a very populist speech. He presents the public as being in conflict with these private utilities. He describes them as parasitic and extractive. And so he tells a story of heroes and villains, the exploited public. And he says, if I'm elected, I will stand up for the exploited public against the exploiters. And what's interesting at the same time is he pairs this populist messaging with a good command of the details. So he talks about how utility systems should be valued in public utility proceedings. It's a sort of speech you would not expect a contemporary politician to give, in that it's both populist and very sophisticated. So he says, this is a fight we need to have. This is not just a question of getting everyone in the room together and making nice. There will be open conflict if we are to succeed, which is really quite alien for those of us today. There are obviously a few politicians who speak in this register, but it's a minority theme. It's not the default, certainly not in the Democratic Party.
Yeah, and one thing I liked about your book is it showed how a at least somewhat democratically responsive government can sort of act in a time of massive technological change. Like electrifying places. You talk about how, like, the South, they're doing refrigeration earlier. In the North, it's more like domestic, I don't know, dishwashers or laundry stuff. But all that stuff is very interesting. And, we're in a time now where we have massive technological change. And the idea is we have to throw our hands up and trust like the lords of creation in
Right.
Silicon Valley to sort of steward it. One of the major examples you talk about is the TVA. And we've talked about this a little bit. David Griscom mentions TVA. We've had a few guests on, but for folks who are unaware of the Tennessee Valley Authority, what's its place in this story?
Yeah, so the TVA today is the nation's largest publicly owned utility. It serves parts of seven states in the Southeast, including Tennessee, as the name would suggest. And the Tennessee Valley Authority was created in FDR's first 100 days in 1933, and it was really set up with two purposes in mind. It did more of one than the other ultimately. So first it was set up to build dams on the Tennessee River to control flooding, to aid inland navigation, and of course generate large amounts of low-cost electricity. And if you look at its history, it's been extraordinarily successful in doing this. It first built dams, then it subsequently built coal-fired power plants, even nuclear power plants. So it's a major utility today, one of the largest in the United States. Second, it was also partly envisioned as a regional development agency. At the time, the Tennessee Valley was among the poorest parts of the United States, and the TVA was seen as a way of providing regional uplift and regional development. So, for instance, low-cost electricity would attract industry to this part of the country away from other parts of the nation. The TVA would foster dispersed development. It would support improved agricultural methods. And it's done this in fits and starts over the past almost century, but it's very much been first and foremost a power company for almost its entire history. The view was if we deliver large quantities of electricity, that will provide a necessary stimulus to promote both agricultural and industrial development.
And you kind of mentioned there was a dream of TVAs covering the entire United States, and that sort of ran into the more conservative post-war, Eisenhower era.
That's right. So the original vision was that the TVA would be the first of several such regional development agencies, that eventually the United States would have a Missouri Valley Authority, a Columbia Valley Authority, even a Connecticut Valley Authority in the Northeast. And it seemed likely that would happen for a time. FDR expressed interest and support in this idea. It was famously publicized and touted by Senator George Norris, the progressive Republican from Nebraska. But due to the conservative backlash in the late 1980s, Roosevelt's shift to other priorities, including the global fight against fascism, the idea of TVAs for the entire nation ultimately fell apart. And so the TVA today is one of a kind. That said, the federal government did launch dam building projects across the country. The Tennessee Valley wasn't the only place where the federal government built dams. So the federal government built large dams on the Columbia River, famously Bonneville near Portland, as well as Grand Coulee in eastern Washington. And so if you look at a map of the United States, especially in the West and the South, the federal government owns dozens, if not hundreds, of dams, and many of which generate hydroelectricity to this day.
And I was born downriver of one of those, Garrison Dam in North Dakota. And I will say your book also does take a lot of care with the different displacements that, those sorts of constructions, particularly on Native American communities, had as well. And it's a very interesting story of the amount of hydroelectric power that was created back then.
Yeah, so it's easy to idealize the New Deal from our vantage point in 2025 when things look rather bleak all around. But it's important to remember that for all the good that the New Deal did, it also had serious social and environmental costs, especially in the power area. As you say, the dams on the Missouri displaced many Native American tribes. Similar things happened in the Pacific Northwest, where the large dams on the Columbia destroyed the fish stocks that had sustained indigenous people for thousands of years. In the Southeast, many tenant farmers were displaced by the TVA's dam building. So it's important to take into account the costs too when we're thinking and reflecting on the New Deal, because it's, if we do a 21st century New Deal today, we don't simply want to copy and paste what FDR did in the 1930s. We want to identify, well, what did he and his administration do right, and where are areas we can do better. And I think understanding and trying to mitigate the adverse impacts is something that we should try to do today. Because oftentimes the New Dealers simply prioritize development and viewed certain people and their interests as expendable.
Right, 100%. Let's talk about climate change. Zooming a little bit forward now, we of course we had a very neoliberal period, and you talked about like the sort of the stop of the advancement of this sort of public power. How would you assess the approach we've taken to climate change? I would say like mainly around de-risking type of investments for people to help the market deals with this stuff, and what should we be doing?
Yeah, so our approach to climate change has been a patchwork of federal, state, and local policies. So, the national level, our primary tool has been tax credits, where we award tax credits for certain projects, for example, wind farms, solar farms. With the Inflation Reduction Act, this was extended to cover all clean energy projects through 2032. And the idea, as you say, was about de-risking, making these projects more attractive for the private sector to pursue and develop. And it's helped a bit. We have more renewable energy online today than we did 20 or 25 years ago. We have a lot of wind. Solar has been growing very dramatically over the past 10 years. At the state and local level, we've seen regulatory mandates that require utilities to source an increasing fraction of their energy from zero carbon or renewable sources. So these have been our primary tools. Think of them as regulatory carrots and sticks. Uh, as I said, we've made some progress, but the progress we've made is not nearly enough to control and limit further climate change. We're not on target to reach net zero by 2050, let alone 2040. So I think we need to be thinking about much more radical and ambitious measures. Tax credits are fine, but they're not going to get us to where we need to be. The private sector doesn't always invest, even if social needs demand it. So I think the New Deal actually offers a useful template of direct public investment. The federal government built dams across the nation decades ago. What if we replicated that now? With the federal government building wind farms, geothermal stations, solar farms. We've done it before. The technology is obviously a little bit different, but I don't think anyone can seriously question whether the federal government is capable of building and operating these facilities. And, in the very near term, I think people quite reasonably say, well, this federal government's not going to pursue public power. Are you crazy? And yeah, I'm not expecting this administration or this Congress to increase appropriations for the TVA or anything of that nature. But if you look at the public power institutions we have in this country, most of them are state or locally owned. And they can actually do a lot in the meantime to advance the ball on renewable energy and decarbonization. So one very exciting project underway is in New York, where in 2023, the legislature gave the state-owned New York Power Authority the express power, no pun intended, to build large-scale renewable projects. The New York Power Authority was actually formed during Governor Roosevelt's tenure in 1931, and now there's a very live and vigorous fight over how much this institution is going to build. You have a number of DSA members of the legislature saying NYPA should go big. The private sector is not investing nearly enough in clean energy in New York. Given this inadequacy, why doesn't the public sector lead? On the other hand, the leadership of this institution doesn't seem that enthusiastic about this new authority. They want to do as little as possible, as far as I can tell. So it's important that public power advocates, climate campaigners keep the pressure on and force them to build more rather than less.
Yeah, we have a lot of institutions that have been operating in a different sort of environment or stasis relative to these questions, and it's how they react to pressure. It's a little bit wanting.
That's right. So if you looked at what happened during the New Deal, institutions like the TVA or the Bonneville Power Administration in the Pacific Northwest, they were led by people who believed in the mission. They believed in public investment. They believed in universal electrification. Today, it's very different. Oftentimes, these agencies are led by people who are not actually that committed to the idea of public power or public investment. In some cases, they've spent the bulk of their careers working for private utilities. And just because they move over to the public sector doesn't mean that they shed the outlook of a private sector executive.
This show, and David more than me, but honestly me too, is generally pro-nuclear, though without being sort of naive about it. And am I taking your read to be that it's mainly, or at least generally understood to be a cost more than a safety issue? And to me, that's kind of interesting because I'm more concerned about the safety things. That scares me a lot more. I think like we're a very rich country. If the
Right.
cost was worth it, at least relative to other options, then we should pursue it. Does nuclear have a place here?
Yeah, I think so. If we can build these plants effectively and efficiently, I think nuclear should play a role in decarbonization. It does something that solar and wind do not. It provides firm 20 power, which is important. We want electricity to remain an on-demand service. The challenge in the United States is that we don't have a great record of building these things. Some of the recent plants that have come online were delayed by years. So the example that I cite is the two newest plants that came online in Georgia, the plant Vogtle units 3 and 4. Unit 3 was supposed to come online in 2016. It was delayed by 7 years. Came online in 2023. Billions of dollars over cost. And you're right on the cost question. If we can spread the cost, ideally to the public fisc, I think the cost issue is very manageable. We're talking about devastating climate change around the world. $1 billion here, $1 billion there shouldn't matter in the grand scheme of things. The problem right now, though, is we finance these projects entirely through ratepayers. So ratepayers in Georgia are paying significantly higher bills now because of the cost overrun from Vogtle units 3 and 4. So if we can figure out how to build these projects, I think nuclear should be a part of the solution. But the history of American nuclear power is not a very pretty one. And I think that's something that boosters of nuclear power often miss. It's true. France was good at building these plants for a time. Japan was good at building these plants for a time. But the history here is very different. It's been defined by repeat cost overruns, repeat delays, performance issues. Many of the nuclear power plants that were shut down in the 70s and 80s weren't shut down because of environmentalist pressure. They were shut down because they were offline so often and that the economics just didn't make sense.
Yeah, and the governments needing to take the initiative on this reminds me of another thing you talked about in terms of innovation, as in, it was prohibitively expensive to electrify rural areas
Right.
until you decide, okay, we actually do want to innovate in that direction. Innovation isn't just like something you unlock in a video game level. It's like something you have to like have an intention toward.
That's exactly right. And New Deal power policy was so successful because the public sector was innovative. So you hit on something very interesting. Private utilities often wrote off the rural market, saying that it's very expensive to build lines into the countryside, and they often cited a figure of, building a line would cost anywhere from $1,500 to $2,000 per mile, a huge sum of money at the time. What the Federal Rural Electrification Administration did was kind of scrutinize line designs and construction techniques, and they quickly found out that a major problem was every rural power system was bespoke. Every new system was being designed from scratch. And so they said, what if we standardize the line designs? What if we simplify the line designs? Maybe with better materials, we can space the poles further apart. We can save money on wood. And the REA found that if we do all these things, we can bring the average cost down to around $750 per mile. That the cost that the private sector was quoting was inflated and reflected certain inefficiencies in line design and construction. And so the public sector was the one innovating here. It wasn't the private sector doing it. The private sector was following. And that is very different from the conventional wisdom today, which says that the private sector is full of all these good innovations. We just need to remove the barriers to innovation and they'll deliver all these good things for the public. The public sector, by contrast, is dysfunctional and never innovative. But if you look at American history, certainly during the 1930s and 40s, it was the public sector leading the way and spurring and forcing the private sector to do better.
This is a great week for us to have you on because earlier in the week I interviewed Rokana, representative from California, and asked a question, not necessarily saying we should follow the China model, but saying we should maybe be concerned that America isn't producing, say, relative to rivals on certain things. And Rokana's response I kind of like, which is that, we don't necessarily need to look to China. We can look at our own history.
Right.
I think your book really kind of shows that. And I'm curious, is there anything else you would emphasize to policymakers? We do have, you need to produce things, and we have problems to solve that take work and electricity. And so is there anything you would emphasize beyond that?
So the United States has a very rich and successful history of public investment and public planning. And that's how we got electricity to every corner of the nation. And one thing that I often tell myself is when it comes to a war in the military industrial complex, fiscal constraints are never an issue. The coffers are open. Why don't we bring that logic to renewable energy investment, to healthcare, to education, to things that make people's lives better? Why do we accept scarcity and austerity when it comes to public goods? And I think one genius of the New Deal, not realized in full measure, but in substantial measure, was the idea that, yes, we can actually spend to make things better for people. We don't need to wait on the private sector to deliver good things. The public sector can provide important direction on technological innovation, and we can simply spend things into existence. That's really how rural electrification happened. The federal government extended low-cost credit, worked with the rural electric cooperatives to build lines into the countryside. And if the government had simply said, we'll trust the private sector to build rural lines, we might not have had full rural electrification until the 80s or the 90s. People are saying in the 1930s that unless we have decisive, vigorous federal involvement here, we're not going to get to even half the farms by 1985. So that's a good model. We did it. It was extraordinarily successful. And one real challenge today is that history has been forgotten. And one motive in writing this book was to tell people that we don't have to accept the narrow constraints and parameters of neoliberalism. We can actually do big things. We've done it before. Let's do it again.
Absolutely. The book is Democracy and Power, A History of Electrification in the United States. Sandeep Vaheesan, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks for having me.